Chapter 2. The Family. Morgan, who spent a great part of his life among the Iroquois Indians, settled to this day in New York State, and was adopted into one of their tribes, the Senecas, found in use among them a system of consanguinity which was in contradiction to their actual family relationships. There prevailed among them a form of monogamy easily terminable on both sides, which Morgan calls the pairing family. The issue of the married pair was therefore known and recognized by everybody. There could be no doubt about whom to call father, mother, son, daughter, brother, sister. But these names were actually used quite differently. The Iroquois calls not only his own children his sons and daughters, but also the children of his brothers, and they call him father. The children of his sisters, however, he calls his nephews and nieces, and they call him their uncle. The Iroquois woman, on the other hand, calls her sister's children, as well as her own, her sons and daughters, and they call her mother. But her brother's children, she calls her nephews and nieces, and she is known as their aunt. Similarly, the children of brothers call one another brother and sister, and so the children of sisters. A woman's own children and the children of her brother, on the other hand, call one another cousins. And these are not mere empty names, but expressions of actual conceptions of nearness and remoteness, of equality and difference, in the degree of consanguinity. These conceptions serve as the foundation of a fully elaborated system of consanguinity through which several hundred different relationships of one individual can be expressed. What is more, this system is not only in full force among all American Indians, no exception has been found up to the present, but also retains its validity almost unchanged among aborigines of India, the Dravidian tribes in the Deccan, and the Gora tribes in Hindustan. To this day, the Tamils of southern India and the Iroquois Seneca Indians in New York State still express more than 200 degrees of consanguinity in the same manner. And among these tribes of India, as among all American Indians, the actual relationships arising out of the existing form of the family contradict the system of consanguinity. How is this to be explained? In view of the decisive part played by consanguinity in the social structure of all savage and barbarian peoples, the importance of a system so widespread cannot be dismissed with phrases. When a system is general throughout America, and also exists in Asia among peoples of quite different race, when numerous instances of it are found in greater or lesser variation in every part of Africa and Australia, then that system has to be historically explained, not talked out of existence as McClellan, for example, tried to do. The names of father, child, brother, sister are no mere complementary forms of address. They involve quite definite and very serious mutual obligations, which together make up an essential part of the social constitution of the peoples in question. The explanation was found. In the Sandwich Islands, Hawaii, there still existed in the first half of the 19th century a form of family in which the fathers and mothers, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters, uncles and aunts, nephews and nieces were exactly what is required by the American and old Indian systems of consanguinity. But now comes a strange thing. Once again, the system of consanguinity in force in Hawaii did not correspond to the actual form of the Hawaiian family. For, according to the Hawaiian system of consanguinity, all children of brothers and sisters are without exception brothers and sisters of one another, and are considered to be the common children not only of their mothers and her sisters, or of their fathers and his brothers, but of all the brothers and sisters of both the parents without distinction. While therefore the American system of consanguinity presupposes a more primitive form of the family which has disappeared in America, but still actually exists in Hawaii. The Hawaiian system of consanguinity, on the other hand, points to a still earlier form of the family, which, though we can nowhere prove it to be still in existence, nevertheless must have existed, for otherwise the corresponding system of consanguinity could never have arisen. Quote, the family, says Morgan, represents an active principle. It is never stationary, but advances from a lower to a higher form as society advances from a lower to a higher condition. Systems of consanguinity, on the contrary, are passive, recording the progress made by the family at long intervals apart, and only changing radically when the family has radically changed. End quote. And, adds Marx, the same is true of the political, juridical, religious, and philosophical systems in general. While the family undergoes living changes, the system of consanguinity ossifies. While the system survives by force of custom, the family outgrows it. But just as Cuvier could deduce from the marsupial bone of an animal skeleton found near Paris that it belonged to a marsupial animal and that extinct marsupial animals once lived there, so with the same certainty we can deduce from the historical survival of a system of consanguinity that an extinct form of family once existed which corresponded to it. The systems of consanguinity and the forms of the family we have just mentioned differ from those of today in the fact that every child has more than one father and mother. In the American system of consanguinity, to which the Hawaiian family corresponds, brother and sister cannot be the father and mother of the same child. But the Hawaiian system of consanguinity, on the contrary, presupposes a family in which this was the rule. Here we find ourselves among forms of family which directly contradict those hitherto generally assumed to be alone valid. The traditional view recognizes only monogamy, with, in addition, polygamy on the part of individual men, and at the very most polyandry on the part of individual women. Being the view of moralizing Philistines, it conceals the fact that in practice these barriers raised by official society are quietly and calmly ignored. The study of primitive history, however, reveals conditions where the men live in polygamy and their wives in polyandry at the same time, and their common children are therefore considered common to them all. And these conditions, in their turn, undergo a long series of changes before they finally end in monogamy. The trend of these changes is to narrow more and more the circle of people comprised within the common bond of marriage, which was originally very wide, until at last it includes only the single pair, the dominant form of marriage today. Reconstructing thus the past history of the family, Morgan, in agreement with most of his colleagues, arrives at a primitive stage when unrestricted sexual freedom prevailed within the tribe, every woman belonging equally to every man and every man to every woman. Since the 18th century, there had been talk of such primitive state, but only in general phrases. Bachofen, and this is one of his greatest merits, was the first to take the existence of such a state seriously and to search for its traces in historical and religious survivals. Today we know that the traces he found do not lead back to a social stage of promiscuous sexual intercourse, but to a much later form, namely group marriage. The primitive social stage of promiscuity, if it ever existed, belongs to such a remote epoch that we can hardly expect to prove its existence directly by discovering its social fossils among backward savages. Bachofen's merit consists in having brought this question to the forefront for examination. Lately, it has become fashionable to deny the existence of this initial stage in human sexual life. Humanity must be spared this shame. It is pointed out that all direct proof of such a stage is lacking, and particular appeal is made to the evidence from the rest of the animal world. For even among animals, according to the numerous facts collected by Lawton Rue, complete promiscuity in sexual intercourse marks a low stage of development. But the only conclusion I can draw from all these facts, so far as man and his primitive conditions of life are concerned, is that they prove nothing whatever. That vertebrates mate together for a considerable period is sufficiently explained by physiological causes. In the case of birds, for example, by the female's need of help during the brooding period. Examples of faithful monogamy among birds prove nothing about man, for the simple reason that men are not descended from birds. And if strict monogamy is the height of all virtue, then the palm must go to the tapeworm, which has a complete set of male and female sexual organs in each of its 50 to 200 troglodytes or sections, and spends its whole life copulating in all its sections with itself. Confining ourselves to mammals, however, we find all forms of sexual life: promiscuity, indications of group marriage, polygyny, monogamy. Polyandry alone is lacking. It took human beings to achieve that. Even our nearest relations, the Quadrumana, exhibit every possible variation in the grouping of males and females. And if we narrow it down still more and consider only the 4 anthropoid apes, all that Lawton Rue has to say about them is that they're sometimes monogamous, sometimes polygamous, while Saussure, quoted by Grant Toulon, maintains that they're monogamous. The more recent assertions of the monogamous habits of the anthropoid apes, which are cited by Westermarck in The History of Human Marriage, are also very far from proving anything. In short, our evidence is such that the honest Lawton Rue admits among mammals there is no strict relation between the degree of intellectual development and the form of sexual life. And Despines says in so many words, quote, "The herd is the highest social group which we can observe among animals. It is composed, so it appears, of families. But from the start, the family and the herd are in conflict with one another, and develop an inverse proportion." End quote. As the above shows, we know practically nothing definite about the family and other social groupings of the anthropoid apes. The evidence is flatly contradictory, which is not to be wondered at. The evidence with regard to savage human tribes is contradictory enough, requiring very critical examination and sifting, and ape societies are far more difficult to observe than human. For the present, therefore, we must reject any conclusion drawn from such completely unreliable reports. The sentence quoted from Espinas, however, provides a better starting point. Among the higher animals, the herd and the family are not complementary to one another, but antagonistic. Espinas shows very well how the jealousy of the males during the mating season loosens the ties of every social herd or temporarily breaks it up. Quote, "When the family bond is close and exclusive, herds form only in exceptional cases. When, on the other hand, free sexual intercourse or polygamy prevails, the herd comes into being almost spontaneously. Before a herd can be formed, family ties must be loosened and the individual must have become free again. This is the reason why organized flocks are so rarely found among birds. We find more or less organized societies among mammals, however, precisely because here, individual is not merged in the family. In its first growth, therefore, the common feeling of the herd has no greater enemy than the common feeling of the family. We stated without hesitation, only by observing families which had undergone a radical change could a social form higher than the family have developed. At the same time, these families were thereby enabled later to constitute themselves afresh under infinitely more favorable circumstances." End quote. Here we see that animal societies are, after all, of some value for drawing conclusions about human societies. But the value is only negative. So far as our evidence goes, the higher vertebrates know only two forms of family, polygyny or separate couples. Each form allows only one adult male, only one husband. The jealousy of the male, which both consolidates and isolates the family, sets the animal family in opposition to the herd. The jealousy of the males prevents the herd, the higher social form, from coming into existence, or weakens its cohesion, or breaks it up during the mating period. At best, it attests its development. This alone is sufficient proof that animal families and primitive human society are incompatible, and that when primitive men, working their way up from the animal creation, they either had no family at all, or a form that does not occur among animals. In small numbers, an animal so defenseless as evolving man might struggle alone even in conditions of isolation, with no higher social grouping than the single male and female pair, such as Westermarck, following the reports of hunters, attributes to the gorillas and chimpanzees. For man's development beyond the level of the animals, for the achievement of the greatest advance nature can show, something more was needed. The power of defense lacking to the individual had to be made good by the united strength and cooperation of the herd. To explain the transition to humanity from conditions such as those in which the anthropoid apes live today would be quite impossible. It looks much more as if these apes had strayed off the line of evolution and were gradually dying out or at least degenerating. That alone is sufficient ground for rejecting all attempts based on parallels drawn between forms of family and those of primitive man. Mutual toleration among the adult males, freedom from jealousy, was the first condition for the formation of those larger permanent groups in which alone animals could become men. And what, in fact, do we find to be the oldest and most primitive form of family, whose historical existence we can indisputably prove, and which in one or two parts of the world we can still study today? Group marriage, the form of family in which whole groups of men and whole groups of women mutually possess one another, and which leaves little room for jealousy. And at a later stage of development, we find an exceptional form of polyandry, which positively revolts every jealous instinct and is therefore unknown among animals. But as all known forms of group marriage are accompanied by such peculiarly complicated regulations that they necessarily point to earlier and simpler forms of sexual relations, and therefore, in the last resort, to a period of promiscuous intercourse corresponding to the transition from the animal to the human, the references to animal marriages only bring us back to the very point from which we were led away for good and all. What then does a promiscuous sexual intercourse really mean? It means the absence of prohibitions and restrictions which are or have been in force. We've already seen the barrier of jealousy go down. If there is one thing certain, it's that the feeling of jealousy develops relatively late. The same is true of the conception of incest. Not only were brother and sister originally man and wife, sexual intercourse between parents and children is still permitted among many peoples today. Bancroft testifies to it among the Kadiaks on the Bering Straits, the Kadiaks near Alaska, and the Tine in the interior of British North America. Lawton Rue compiled reports of it among the Chippewa Indians, the Cocos in Chile, the Caribs, the Karens in Burma, to say nothing of the stories told by the old Greeks and Romans about the Parthians, Persians, Sisypheans, Huns, and so on. Before incest was invented, for incest is an invention, and a very valuable one too, sexual intercourse between parents and children did not arouse any more repulsion than sexual intercourse between other persons of different generations. And that occurs today even in the most Philistine countries without exciting any great horror. Even old maids of over 60, if they're rich enough, sometimes marry young men in their 30s. But if we consider the most primitive known forms of family apart from their conceptions of incest, conceptions which are totally different from ours and frequently in direct contradiction to them, then the form of sexual intercourse can only be described as promiscuous. Promiscuous insofar as the restrictions later established by custom did not yet exist. But in everyday practice, that by no means necessarily implies general mixed mating. Temporary pairings of one man with one woman were not in any way excluded. Just as in the case of group marriages today, the majority of relationships are of this character. And when Westermarck, the latest writer to deny the existence of such a primitive state, applies the term marriage to every relationship in which the two sexes remain mated until the birth of the offspring, we must point out that this kind of marriage can very well occur under the conditions of promiscuous intercourse without contradicting the principle of promiscuity, the absence of any restriction imposed by custom on sexual intercourse. Westermarck, however, takes the standpoint that promiscuity, quote, involves a suppression of individual inclinations, and that, therefore, the most genuine form of it is prostitution, end quote. In my opinion, any understanding of primitive society is impossible to people who only see it as a brothel. We will return to this point when discussing group marriage. According to Morgan, from this primitive state of promiscuous intercourse, there developed probably very early the consanguine family, the first stage of the family. Here, the marriage groups are separated according to generations. All the grandfathers and grandmothers within the limits of the family are all husbands and wives of one another. So are also their children, the fathers and mothers. The latter's children will form a third circle of common husbands and wives, and their children, the great-grandchildren of the first group, will form a fourth. In this form of marriage, therefore, only ancestors and progeny, and parents and children are excluded from the rights and duties, as we should say, of marriage with one another. Brothers and sisters, males and female cousins of the first, second, and more remote degrees, are all brothers and sisters of one another, and precisely for that reason, they are all husbands and wives of one another. At this stage, the relationship of brother and sister also includes, as a matter of course, the practice of sexual intercourse with one another. In its typical form, such a family would consist of the descendants of a single pair, the descendants of these descendants in each generation being again brothers and sisters, and therefore husbands and wives of one another. The consanguine family is extinct. Even the most primitive peoples known to history provide no demonstrable instance of it. But that it must have existed, we are compelled to admit. For the Hawaiian system of consanguinity, still prevalent today throughout the whole of Polynesia, expresses degrees of consanguinity which could only arise in this form of family. and the whole subsequent development of the family presupposes the existence of the consanguine family as a necessary preparatory stage.